Hi guys, it's Pastor Ken here. Just wanted to share a devotional thought and prayer for today. And actually this week I wanted to do a series for our daily devotions on the biblical theology of quarantine. The Bible actually says quite a lot about public health, and of course it would have to. If you have 3 million people traveling throughout the desert, throughout the wilderness, then you got to be making sure that if someone has a contagious disease, that you have some kind of system, a public health system, to make sure that all 3 million people don't get infected and end up dead. And the part of the Bible that deals with public health is Leviticus. Leviticus is the system for public health in the Bible, especially in the first 5 books of the Bible, or the Torah. And I wanted to read from Leviticus chapter 13, verse 45, and this is to deal with people who do have contagious skin diseases. If someone is contagious, what do you do with them? And so Exodus chapter 13, verse 45, anyone with such a defiling disease, a contagious disease, must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt, cover the lower parts of their face and cry out, unclean, unclean. As long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside the camp. They must live alone. They must live outside the camp. They must be placed in quarantine for the sake of the greater good. Now, the whole passage of Leviticus that deals with these contagious skin diseases, basically it goes through a system. Is this disease contagious? Put them in quarantine, see what happens. Let's check the symptoms. And then it says if they are, then they must live outside the camp, away from everyone else, so they're not spreading the disease to everyone else. And then when they get better, or if they do get better, they get some tests done, set aside for a little time, see if it comes back, and then they give thanks to God that they're better. They no longer have to be quarantined. And so it's the Bible's quite sophisticated. We might think it's some kind of book that's irrelevant, and this part of the Bible was written 3,000 years ago. But even then, they had public health concerns, public health systems, and they had a system for quarantine. The public health aspects of the book of Leviticus are actually just the external fruit of a deeper root, of a spiritual reality that the rest of the book of Leviticus talks about, in that we are all contaminated with this thing called sin. We're all kind of infected with this desire to rebel against God, to put ourselves before anyone else, to live selfish lives. And that brings about all sorts of brokenness in the world. Now, even our current social isolation, which is the government's public health response to COVID-19, that's a metaphor for what we've done, for what all of humans have done, that we have alienated. This idea that we're distant from one another, we're kind of alienated from our friends because we can't hang out with them anymore. That's a picture of the alienation that we have done between us and God, even between us and other human beings. We're all alienated now. we're all living lives as though we're sick. We're all living lives as though we're infected. Most of us aren't infected, but we're living lives as though we are. We're living lives like we all need a doctor, that we're all sick. And you know what? That's just the fruit. That's just a metaphor for a deeper spiritual reality, that we are all in need of a doctor. We are all sick. We actually are all infected. But you know what? That sounds like bad news, right? This biblical theology of quarantine, it's kind of like all bad news. Well, it's not, because God has a desire to end the quarantine. He's wanting to put in place. Even now there's people scientists working on how we can end this social isolation and this quarantine that's needed if we're traveling from overseas, all that kind of stuff. And we're hoping for a vaccine to come out one day. But you know what? God has a plan, and He has a purpose, and He's wanting to end our deeper quarantine, our spiritual quarantine. There is a biblical theology of quarantine, and there's good news in the biblical story of how God deals with quarantine. He wants to end the spiritual quarantine, and ultimately He wants to end all physical quarantine forever and ever. And so let me pray into that. God, I thank you so much I thank you that your Bible is actually a fount of incredible wisdom. Even from 3,000 years ago, book of Leviticus was dealing with public health issues. And here we are living in one of the biggest public health crises the world has ever seen, and putting into place some of the same principles that we find in the book of Leviticus, the idea of social distancing. And I thank you that it's actually a picture, though. Leviticus isn't primarily about public health. It's primarily about our spiritual health, about what's going on inside of us. And I thank you that you have an answer, that you are wanting to end the quarantine in us, between us and you. We were kind of kicked out of your presence because we were infected, we were corrupted, and you're perfect and you're holy. But you're wanting to make a difference, to bring it, and you're wanting to heal us. None of us get to point the finger and say, I'm better than that person. None of us get to point the finger and say, I'm more moral than that person. We're all infected. But you have a plan, Jesus. you have a plan, God, to end the quarantine. And we can't wait to explore that throughout the rest of this week. In your name we pray, Jesus. Amen. Well, guys, that's it from me. I'm Pastor Ken, and as always, be blessed.